to this discussion organised by ECFR and MAGIC, looking at climate migration and European cooperation. My name is Susie Dennison. I'm the Director for the European Power Programme at ECFR, and I'm really delighted to be chairing this conversation today. Because although 2020 has been a year that has been very much taken over by the COVID crisis and the questions of how we handle health at a European level, the work that we've been doing at ECFR, particularly our public opinion surveying, has shown the extent to which climate and migration still very much top Europeans' concerns. In particular, we can see that climate is an issue in which people in all the European states that we've been surveying indicate that the COVID crisis has increased their concern about the need for climate cooperation rather than replaced it. And we see as well the importance of migration management in the way that Europeans are thinking about the world and the challenges in front of them. It was one of the top 3 areas where, when we asked how Europe should change after the COVID crisis, the idea of border control at a European level was the 3rd biggest answer from across the average of the European states that we're looking at. So this feels like a really important topic, and one that shouldn't be allowed to sort of fall off the agenda with the current focus on COVID. And clearly there are deep interlinkages between both the climate challenge and indeed the migration challenge with that health question too. And I'm really excited that we've got 3 great speakers to help us through this issue and to look at what the current issues, opportunities and challenges are around these themes at the moment. We're going to hear firstly from François Germain, who is director of the Hugo Observatory at the University of Liège. The Hugo Observatory is focused on the interaction between environmental changes, human migration and politics. Our second speaker is going to be Caroline Zickgraf, who is also from the Hugo Observatory, and she's going to be looking particularly at the policy dimension for us on these questions. And our third speaker this morning is Chloe Teven, who's a policy officer at ECDPM. She's focused in the External Affairs Department on the EU-AU relationship, and also the EU as a geopolitical actor. And we're particularly pleased to have her here at this ECFR meeting because she's part of the wider ECFR family, having worked with us previously. So without any further comment from me, because obviously we've got great, more informed speakers to hear from, I'm going to give the floor now to François. If you could give us your sense of how these issues come together in about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much. And thanks a lot to the European Council on Foreign Relations for the organization of this seminar. What I'd like to say as an introduction to this seminar is the first to point out the fact that our perceptions of climate change and migration are usually very different from the realities of migration patterns that we observe on the field. When I started, and that's always been the case, it seems, when I started my PhD some 15 years ago, back in 2005, when I would discuss about climate change and migration, people assumed that I was speaking of the migration of animals, and people would refer to me about the migration of birds or the migration of salmons. And today, obviously, that has become, in 15 years, a key policy priority, which is widely discussed, including at the European level. But when it is discussed today, somehow, I have the impression that it is still perceived as a kind of future risk that we could still and we should manage to avoid. You might have seen these cartoons in the press during the time of the lockdown back in the spring that would show the COVID-19 as one wave and climate change as a second wave that would come behind and that would be much, much bigger. And I think that this perception of climate change and its impacts on migration is deeply flawed because the reality is that first, climate change is already today a major driver of migration and displacement. But the impact of climate change interact and influence with the other drivers of migration and, most importantly, the political and economic drivers of migration. So we still have a tendency to see climate-induced migration as a separate category that would be completely distinct from the categories of political refugees or economic migrants. But the reality is that these different migration drivers are deeply intermingled with each other and do influence each other. So I think that we should first, if we want to have a serious discussion on the policy responses to migration related to climate change, we would need to first consider that this is already a reality today and not something that we'll be able to avoid tomorrow. And two, that this is not a separate category from the global migration dynamics. And instead, we should try and understand better what is the weight of climate change and environmental drivers on the political, economic, or cultural drivers of migration. To give you just one example, if one considers migration from sub-Saharan Africa, which is at the moment a key focus of European policymaking on migration and a key focus of the migration agenda. In sub-Saharan Africa, about half of the population depends on subsistence agriculture as a primary source of livelihood. Subsistence agriculture is highly vulnerable to any change in the rainfall or in the temperature, meaning that when it rains a bit less than usual or when it's a bit warmer than usual, people lose their livelihood. And therefore, if they come to Europe, we will classify them as economic migrants simply because they come from a country that is not at war. But the reality is that for them, the environment and the economy is pretty much the same thing. Their income on a day-to-day basis depends on environmental conditions. And this is very often a Western view to distinguish between the environment and the economy. My paycheck at the end of the month does not depend on the weather. But for most people on the planet, it does. And I think this is also a reality that is crucial to recognize for policy responses. I'm also struck as to how in the European policy debates, there is still often this idea that international law will solve the problem. And even today in 2020, pretty much every 2 or 3 months, I get contacted by a policymaker, usually an MEP, who has the idea that we should create a status in international law for the people displaced as a result of climate change. This idea of a legal status for climate change refugees has been floating around for at least 10 or 12 years. And still today in 2020, there are still MEPs who think they've had the idea of the century by designing a legal status for climate refugees. And I think that we've already explained many times why this was not necessarily a bad idea, but not a magical recipe that would solve the problem. And one of the key reasons for that is that most of the migration related to climate change, at least in developing countries, is internal. And therefore, people move within the borders of their country. And we still have a tendency to consider that internal migration and international migration have nothing to do with one another. And when we discuss climate change and migration, very much, we focus only on international migration and we turn a blind eye to internal migration. I think this is a terrible mistake to do. And if we want to address climate change and migration, we also need to address internal migration. It does not just become an issue as soon as people cross a border, but also within borders. That needs to be managed. And there is a need today for policy responses about that. Just to outline a few of what those policy responses could be in terms of development or adaptation. One thing to consider is the fact that these policy responses will need to target not only the regions of origin, but also the regions of destination. Very often, all the development or adaptation agenda is geared towards the region of origin in order to avoid people would have to migrate. But people do migrate, and sometimes people do migrate because it is a way for them to adapt to environmental changes. And therefore, our policies need to target also the destination areas. And I'm thinking in particular, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, about little and mid-sized cities that would need to develop more housing opportunities and job opportunities. I think that the development of job market outside of agriculture in rural areas is really one of the keys to mitigate the climate impacts on a local level. Another important thing to consider is to take better account of the perceptions of people. What we observe on the field is that very much people perceive the impacts of climate change differently from the realities of the climate impacts. So that means that when we confront what people tell us about climate change with the actual data on climate change in the area, they don't always match. And obviously, adaptation policies and development policies are geared towards the climate data and the climate projections and scenarios and models. But this is not how people perceive the impacts of climate change. And people will often make their decision not on the basis of data, but on the basis of their perceptions. And of course, this is extremely important that we account for that in policy responses as well. There is also the fact, but Caroline will elaborate much more into that, there is also the fact that people will be prevented from migrating and will find themselves unable to move. And in some cases, the facilitation of migration will need to be a policy priority. And the fourth point, I think, is that we need to stop thinking that nothing is being done. I'm always struck when discussing with policymakers, including high-level policymakers, that they are not very well aware that programs and projects are already ongoing and needs to be supported. I just want to mention, for example, in the Horn of Africa, countries of the region have recently agreed on a protocol of free movement within the Horn of Africa. This is a very significant development, and this is a policy decision that was taken in reaction to the impacts of climate change and in reaction to the fact that people very often had to migrate from one place to another in search of new land. And therefore, this policy development, which was barely mentioned in the policy debates, at least in Europe, is extremely important in the Horn of Africa. Similarly, there is an international organization called the Platform on Disaster Displacement, which is supported by the European Union, which is at the moment, until the end of December, chaired by France, which is directly responsible for supervising and implementing projects and programs related to the climate migration nexus. And this organization is virtually unknown in European circles. And I think this is another dimension to consider, the fact that these ongoing programs and projects need to be better supported. And final point that I wanted to make in this short introduction, we will also be leading at the Hugo Observatory a major research project on this topic, which is called Habitable, and which has started 2 months ago on September 1st. And really the goal of this project is to move beyond the big numbers and to try to understand at the macro level, at the household and individual level, why and how people make the decision to migrate or the decision to stay. And I think that we see in policy debates and in the press a lot of big numbers being floated around, but that does not explain why and how people decide to migrate. And this is really what we would need to know for the design of future policy responses. So these are the few points that I wanted to highlight as an introduction.
Thank you very much indeed. It was a great introduction and a great overview for how these themes come together in reality, and also quite eye-opening in terms of some of the challenges which you laid out for us there. Caroline, if I could turn to you next. Francois has pushed us sort of when thinking about the policy response on this front to focus not only on sending countries, but also receiving countries in terms of how we manage the impact of the movement of people and climate change. I would be really interested to hear from you sort of how you see the current developments in the policy field in terms of these issues, and where you see the sort of the hope and where you see the gaps in terms of the current picture.
thank you so much. And thank you to Francois for also, I think, an excellent starting overview, and not just because he's my boss. I'm going to quickly just put on a little PowerPoint, try to keep some attention. I know we're all end of the week, full of Zoom calls. So I want to focus a little bit more on that policy dimension. Obviously, in such a short time period, you can't go in depth into each area because, as Francois mentioned, there is no silver bullet here because there is no one way that climate relates to migration. And so again, this is part of the problematic policy thinking, is that if you seek this global narrative, you're going to think that there's just one thing to be done. But because these links are so complex and the outcomes can be so different, you really have to look at this, just like we do with climate change, as a kind of a la carte options, and that there's so many different things that we have to combine in order to respond to the challenges that are presented, but also to maximize those opportunities that are there. So I know that we're going to be touching more on the Green Deal in the next presentation and most likely the discussion. But I just did want to touch here the one area in which the communication on the Green Deal speaks to migration. So it's not a lot. So, in a way that gives us a lot of room to see how we might integrate migration and displacement, or the umbrella term being human mobility, into all of these different the Green Deal elements. Is again, by having to think a bit creatively, but this is the text that is presented. So again, the EU wanting to work to prevent challenges from becoming sources of conflict, food insecurity, population displacement, and forced migration. So not a lot touching on these voluntary or more voluntary aspects, as Francois has mentioned, this complicated, blurred boundaries between economic and environmental migration. It's also very blurred when we try to talk about displacement or forced migration and voluntary migration, particularly for me when I'm in the field in sub-Saharan Africa. Most people who would be economic migrants or voluntary migrants very rarely say that this is voluntary, and much rather see it as forced, even if they have more time to move or to prepare. They're not moving because it's a wanderlust, right? So I know that we've touched a little bit about some MEPs, but I do think we have to acknowledge that the Parliament, the European Parliament, has been recently taking an interest in climate and migration in a little bit more of a nuanced way. And I think that's shown by the fact that you have 3 different committees in the EU Parliament who over the past year have been working to put together reports on climate and migration and resolutions. And in relevance to this, the topic of our talk today, that the DEVE committee is actually the one that was leading the main report. And I think that speaks to this idea of the external dimension and how important the Parliament sees the international cooperation on these issues. But also, also promising in the way that you have multiple committees looking at it, and it not just being, for example, ENVI, just coming from an environmental aspect or just coming from development, but you also have LIBE, for example, who's really looking at the social dimensions and implications of these movements. So what I want to kind of focus more in on is on these different policy areas where I think that there's a lot of work to be done. Speaks to some of these maybe misconceptions or in some ways perhaps just simplifications, not seeing the bigger picture in each of these realms, but rather focusing typically on one small aspect of these policy dimensions as they relate to climate migration. And I think any talk you're going to go to, I think that goes for climate change more broadly, you're going to hear things like bridging silos and bridging gaps. So I will try to avoid using that language as best as I can. But I do think, again, this is not just to isolate these different policy areas, but to see how each action influences and relates to these other dimensions. So one, I think, clear area for intervention is humanitarian intervention. Now, typically, we see this as potentially just humanitarian aid, providing post-disaster relief. As Francois has mentioned, most people are displaced within their countries when a natural disaster occurs. And so again, that component post-disaster relief is extremely important, but especially when we put emphasis on post-disaster relief focused towards people who are displaced, but also the idea that there's more that can be done, and without reinventing the wheel or creating a new refugee status, we have lots of tools at our disposal that are already existing. And so, for example, one element would be the provision of humanitarian visas. So providing humanitarian visas to people who've been displaced by disasters. And we've seen that in other countries of the world. Brazil, for example, providing humanitarian visas for those displaced. And so these are also not just things we have to look at within the EU existing toolbox as it's currently applied, but also where we can maybe look elsewhere, look to other places who've done different things and with varying degrees of success, but of course learning from that. So humanitarian visas is one way to again speak to promoting migration and promoting protection instruments that don't just stop at throwing money after a disaster. Now to development, that's also I think an area in which this really speaks to this idea of a focus on developing countries or providing development aid in order to stop migration. So this is also what we see with climate adaptation, that if we pump a bunch of effort into adaptation in communities of origin, the goal is that people don't migrate. Now that's a good goal if people don't want to migrate, and if that creates better conditions for them to enable the choice. But it can't be this kind of top-down, the whole focus is solving climate migration. Again, this is something that's continually asked. How do we solve this problem? But again, you're starting from the point that it's exclusively a problem. And so development can also be about approaching it as maximizing the benefits of migration and making sure, of course, people are moving in safe, orderly, and regular manners, not arriving in precarious conditions, not actually increasing their displacement risk after they've moved, but also seeing things like remittances as potentially things that can be beneficial for adaptation. But I want to say that cautiously, because I never want to sound like migrants are Euro signs, right? That we need to see them as just financial utilitarian approaches. Also, let's see things like social remittances, thinking about the beliefs, the values, the skills transfers that can happen. And that's multi-directional, right? That's not just migrants sending things back, but also seeing how those links between places can be maximized for the benefits of destination, the benefits of communities of origin, and for the migrants themselves. So again, this is an issue when we see them just as sources of money, that we kind of forget that they're also people who we also need to prioritize. Thirdly, that comes to migration policy, perhaps quite an obvious element, but not one that has been as focused on the issues in environment as environmental policy domains, which have been much more keen to take up in migration concerns than migration has taken up environmental concerns. We have seen some movement on that, but we need to mainstream the environment into migration policy. And again, seeing about how we can potentially facilitate migration, whether that's through internal relocation programs, or through things like bilateral labor agreements. So this is, again, something that we already have at our disposal, something that's already happening. Labor agreements between EU member states and states that maybe are facing climatic change, and looking at agreements such as the one between Spain and Colombia that, are mutually beneficial. So you facilitate migration out of areas that are disaster prone or particularly affected by impacts of climate change, and create those labor agreements, whether it's seasonal, whether it's permanent, but making these kind of ways of using what we already have at our disposal. And lastly, I've probably gone well beyond my time. So lastly, just helping with data and research. That's one of the #1 things that it comes to when I'm speaking with, for example, ECOWAS, West African governments, is that it's very difficult to act without appropriate data and research, and they just don't have that at their disposal now. And so this big push for evidence-based policy, we also have to be promoting the evidence collection, again, because of this internal dimension, that these are countries who often have very little internal migration statistics, and really need that to promote their own policies, but also to be working with EU member states based on what data is actually accurate and reliable. So with that, I will just put up the link to the project that François mentioned. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for that presentation. I'm sure we're all going to be going to the website after the discussion, but I'd encourage people to stick with us for now through the conversation. But it sounds really fascinating, and I think some really important points that you've raised there in terms of sort of the framework for thinking about these issues in the policy response, and some of the sort of the issues, the perceptional challenges that we have at the moment in that policy response. I'm going to turn now to our third speaker, Chloe. I'd be really keen to hear from you, Chloe, sort of focusing particularly on the European policy response, because the third part of our conversation today is about EU cooperation. And I would be keen to sort of hear from you in the way that Caroline has sort of laid out for us in the international policy response, where we need to do better, where we need to push further. What do you see, what's done, what's still to do in the kind of the range of proposals that are on the table or working their way through the EU institutions at the moment? And if you would be willing as well, I'd be keen to hear from you sort of who you see as the kind of the enlightened member states or institutions within Europe on this front, and where you see the challenges.
Thanks, Susie, and thanks to Francois and Caroline for the wonderful presentations. I've learned a lot myself from this. So yes, I'll look a little bit more at the Green Deal, and particularly at the external dimension of the Green Deal. This is, and then looking specifically at the EU-Africa relationship and how climate and migration play in there a little bit. So I think everybody is probably aware of the Green Deal and what it is trying to achieve, but it's very much more than just being about addressing climate change. It's also being presented very much as a growth agenda for Europe, as a way to transform the European economy and society through industrial policy, agricultural policy, transport, construction, energy. And despite some misgivings, the Green Deal has very much survived the COVID pandemic so far, and is being seen as part of the recovery to that. Going forward, the EU is very much looking at the Green Deal as an opportunity for it to show global leadership as well, directly through climate diplomacy, development cooperation and strategic investment, but also through the indirect means, such as the Brussels effect, and through this idea that European regulation is often picked up by companies around the world, and because the EU is such an important market, that companies often decide that they'll use EU regulation globally. And this has happened with environmental regulation in the past, and is something that the EU has a strong focus on now in terms of its soft power in the world going forward. In terms of how the EU is working with partners, when it comes to the Green Deal, there is an effort to build climate partnerships, international green deals. We've already seen with the Balkans that the EU is discussing a Green Deal with the Balkans. And in the EU's Africa strategy that it released in March this year, a large focus of that was also on a green transition, on a partnership for green transition and energy access. But it has been interesting to see how there's a very different approach from the EU and from the African Union, and how these agendas don't necessarily overlap. And this speaks to some of the things that ultimately Francois was talking about earlier. The EU is still not focusing enough on agriculture, on the informal sector, on human development, on climate adaptation. And a lot of the focus is on productive and technology sectors, which in sub-Saharan Africa are often quite underdeveloped still. So while both the EU and the AU are very active in multilateral climate negotiations, there's no strong multilateral common alliance when it comes to climate between these two regions. And despite its ambition to lead on climate, the EU hasn't yet forged a lasting partnership with the African continent. In order for the partnership to produce concrete results on climate, some degree of convergence may be needed, including on the EU using its funds strategically in support of adaptation efforts on the African continent. Which brings us to the tools that the EU has available at the moment, which the EU is currently in the process of programming its new Neighbourhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument, the NDICI, which is the new international cooperation instrument of the EU, bringing multiple instruments together under one strategic and flexible tool. And this is a response to many different geopolitical and challenges, amongst these being certainly how to respond to climate, and also the focus on flexibility was very much in the aftermath of the migration and refugee crisis in 2015, 2016. Now we see that with the programming of this instrument, the EU is rolling out what it calls the Team Europe approach, which is about focusing on European unity and visibility in the programming of this instrument, and that there's a very strong focus on climate. However, as we've already noted, it will be important to see that this isn't just about European countries being united, but about really listening to local stakeholders, so that, following on from what Francois and Caroline have said, that it's very important that ultimately this responds to the local circumstances, and that it is not about a European agenda on climate being put in place when it comes to programming the development funds that are available. Just to conclude, that there is real room for greater cooperation around climate, and the Green Deal offers an important opportunity, but it will be very important to focus on what local stakeholders, and particularly, well, the African Union when it comes to the macro relationship, but then the local stakeholders when it comes to the member states of the African Union. Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe. That was a really helpful insight into sort of the various strands that are underway at European level that relate to this picture, and also the sort of the European Union lens for understanding these issues through the policy response. I want to open up for discussion now, and in terms of how that's going to work, because we're virtual, I would encourage people to put up their hand. So if you're not sure how to do this, if you hover over the participants button at the bottom of your screen, you should get the option in the screen on the right to raise your hand. So the easiest way would be is if you could do that electronically. If you don't trust your internet connection to come in and have the floor for whatever reason, then you can also put a message to all, or just to me if you like, I'm Susie Dennison, in the chat function on the side of the screen, and I can read that out. But while you're working out what you want to say and how to do it, I'm going to abuse my position as chair and just ask one or two questions to the speakers, which occurred to me in the presentations. So I want to come back to this issue of the sort of the politics around these themes. I know that's kind of part of your raison d'être at the Hugo Observatory, and I know it's also very much part of the work that Chloe does at ECDPM, as well as for us at ECFR. And I was very interested, François, in your comments about the fact that that perception versus reality on kind of what is driving migration is very important, and I would be interested to kind of hear from any of you as speakers, sort of what's under that. Is that to do with our understanding in tackling this issue at sort of within the policy discussion, or is that some sort of something deeper that we're responding to the kind of the political imperative around public opinion on this, and the kind of the answer is more in terms of sort of a more informed discussion more broadly about how these questions come together, and you know, kind of when we're thinking through the policy response, you know, how can we tackle that? How can we make sure that that we're sort of supporting policies which are kind of better targeted to address the real problems? I don't know who wants to come in on that. François,
I'm happy to offer some insights. I'd like to start with an anecdote. While I was doing my PhD thesis, I got to spend 3 months in Tuvalu in the South Pacific. This is less exciting than you think. You can easily get bored. The beaches are not that great. But as some of you probably know, Tuvalu is one of the flattest countries on Earth. And therefore, sea level rise is a real concern, and some of the islands might actually disappear as a result of sea level rise. And when I was there as a PhD student, I would, of course, ask people about how they perceived sea level rise and how they were affected by sea level rise. And a lot of them would tell me this. They would tell me that they didn't have any problems regarding floodings or sea level rise until the day when 2 Australian scientists came to measure sea level rise. And the Australian scientists spent a week on the island, and people would tell me, and when they left, we started having problems and floods all the time. And obviously, the fact that the Australian scientists came to measure sea level rise had no impact on the sea level rise itself, but I think that people perceived it differently, and that some signs that they would pay no attention to, they started paying attention, and this started to become a worry for them and a concern for them. And obviously, we observe the same kind of phenomena in sub-Saharan Africa, and people very often have a tendency to pay attention to some changes or variations in the weather, especially if they can relate this to something that they've heard in the news or that they've heard about climate change. And therefore, this raises a very fundamental question for migration and development agendas. That is, shall we develop policies on the basis of the actual data, or shall we develop policies on the basis of people's perceptions? For example, if it rains less, and if the data shows that there is a deficit in rainfall, you might want to set up an irrigation system. But people might perceive the irrigation system as useless if their feeling is that it rains more and more. And therefore, I think this raises a very important questions. And after all, we also perceive things very differently from the way they are. I mean, I'm sure that if I ask all people, let's imagine that we're all in the same city. If I ask all participants to the seminar about the weather today, we'll have at least 10 different opinions about the weather of today, because it's a matter of individual perceptions. And I think this is really something that is important, and that will be really a key aspect that we shall try and investigate in the Habitable project that I mentioned in my introduction.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Francois. Yeah, sort of listening to your answer, it strikes me that the microcosm of the people within this discussion and the differences of views is kind of reflected 100-fold when we think about international organizations such as the EU in sort of trying to develop thinking in this area. And since we're sort of thinking about the question of cooperation and cohesion, do you, and this is kind of addressed to any of you on the panel that are interested to respond on this, do you see differences, irreconcilable differences in this kind of perceptional issue of how you should respond at European level at the moment? I mean, certainly we saw migration as one of the most kind of divisive matters. Migration management as one of the most divisive matters that has kind of confronted the EU around the refugee crisis in 2015, and the fallout from that was huge. But I wonder how you see the sort of the interplay with climate, where there does seem to be kind of more common feeling about the necessity of European level action, even if the kind of the trade-offs within that are quite complex. So yeah, I'm not sure if who would like to sort of come in on this point in differences across Europe.
Yeah, I'll just step in. I'm not sure that I'll fully answer the question, but you know, I guess you're catching me on a Friday when Georgia's just flipped in the US election. So when you say irreconcilable differences, it's also a matter of perception.
Perspectives.
You know, so I'm not so sure what's irreconcilable in comparison to the US at the moment, but no, I mean, I think that, you know, while, you know, we can look at different public opinions across the EU and different opinions across political parties about these issues, you know, I do think that there is more of a common bond in terms of the narrative that's presented in Europe than, which is maybe a problem that it's too reconciled. And, you know, not that we don't want harmonious action, but we don't want a false narrative or a securitarian narrative being what unites us. And so this is where you see, for example, different political parties or perspectives coming together in a bit of a strange marriage. So when you have people, again, speaking to what Francois said about, or organizations or parties saying, this is a future threat, and you know the 2015 refugee crisis was just a harbinger, and using that kind of fear of migration to promote climate action, and then you know maybe you can unite people across the aisle or across the spectrum because everybody's scared of migration. So what better tool to use than these people? But you know, people usually not being the word that's used, migrants or waves or refugees. And I think that's an issue because you know you're uniting in the wrong way. So you're using a fear of migration, of a future threat when it's already happening. And what you're doing is you're actually creating an environment in terms of public opinion, but also political opinion that moves towards restrictive borders. So you're aiming for climate action, and what you're getting is restrictive migration policies. So in that way, I'd rather have more of a debate and more of people disagreeing and organizations disagreeing about how to frame this, because it just too easily falls into a strange combination of a humanitarian perspective of help the refugees, help the poor climate migrants, and too little, and at the same time, the security perspective, and much less into this domain about migration as adaptation and how can we facilitate this migration as beneficial? How can we protect these people? So in that way, maybe I'm just triggered again by that, my current state of, my current political state. But in that way, yeah, I'd rather have more, not discord, but more of an actual debate and not one that uses migrants as weapons.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's great to have a counterintuitive response. Thank you very much indeed for that. I do want to encourage others to come in because I realise that I'm dominating the discussion a little bit here. So do feel free anytime to raise your hand and put questions in. But this kind of pushes me on to a point which interested me, Chloe, that you raised about the fact that although we have the kind of the goal of a partnership for managing a green transition between Europe and Africa, as things stand, there is no sort of common effort at multilateral level to sort of make anything of that. And I wondered whether you see potential for more in terms of multilateral cooperation, sort of either between those two groups of states, or if you kind of see a way of Europeans working on these issues differently within the international system, or whether that's kind of pie in the sky, really, sort of given the political context that we've been talking about.
Well, that's actually what my next research project is on, is very much
perfect.
where you know, where the EU and the AU can work together more effectively at multilateral fora. I think climate is one of the areas that clearly is so important. The flipping of Georgia may also be very important in terms of climate action. But when it comes to the EU has tended to emphasize that it wants a comprehensive multilateral partnership with Africa, which seems to suggest that we should vote together on everything. But very much what I've heard in Addis Ababa when we did interviews there was very much that from the African Union's perspective, the interests don't always converge, and that for African negotiators, it's very important that the EU listens and that the partnership really is something that is negotiated between both sides and is no longer, a question of the EU talking down to African stakeholders. And there's definitely been a shift in terms of the way the EU is listening to African partners now. And a lot of African ambassadors and policymakers have noted that, but there's still a ways to go before, on a question like climate, we can really have a comprehensive partnership which takes into account the interests of both. And in that way, the fact that the EU-AU summit was postponed to next year is perhaps a good thing, because it allows more time to negotiate a joint position. And I think climate is perhaps the most important area to come to a common position. I think on migration, it's much less likely that there will be convergence.
Maybe thanks very much, Chloe, and really looking forward to seeing your upcoming sort of exploration of this, because I think it is a really important area. And yeah, sort of maybe to follow on from that, to give Caroline an opportunity to talk about what's on her mind, sort of keeping it at the multilateral level. We've seen during the period of the Trump administration sort of the two big multilateral initiatives relating to this field, the Paris Climate Agreement and the Global Compact on Migration, sort of run into difficulties because of these differences that we've been talking about between the different national perspectives and the political imperatives at home in the various member states. I mean, if the flip in Georgia is a kind of an indication of where the election is going to end up, how do you see, or do you see US leadership as being sort of helpful in the kind of the international policy response on this front, and where do you see the sort of the next priorities as being after the kind of the efforts to come to a set of common principles, I guess, around the two themes? Would it be useful to come back to this, or do you see it being as being sort of more of an effort to approach these issues kind of in a more piecemeal way, sort of building up the policy response rather than starting at the top on kind of overarching principles?
Yes, thank you. To speak to U.S. leadership on these issues, I mean, I don't think there has been nor is there a need for the U.S. to lead these issues. I don't think that the U.S. has demonstrated, and really, to be honest, it's not a political party thing. I think the U.S. in general has not demonstrated that they have any desire to lead discussions on climate and migration, or the links between. I mean, you still have in the U.S. them referring to people who are displaced by disasters within their country, particularly when those people are of minorities, minority groups or indigenous groups, and calling them climate refugees, which doesn't make any sense because they're US citizens. And, and for indigenous groups, they're the first, the only ones who aren't migrants. And so I think already the US is not the place to look for leadership, and nor does it need to be. I think, and this speaks to what Chloe was saying, I think that this also comes back to this idea that the leadership coming from whether it's from the European Union or from the United States, I think we might be looking at that the wrong way around. So, looking at people who are still thinking this is a future issue and not looking towards the countries that are dealing with this on a daily basis already. So, explaining to people from my work in Senegal, for example, policymakers, you don't ever have to convince them that people are moving because of the environment, or that they will move, or that any of that. That's, again, it comes to a question of data. So I would prefer look to countries for leadership that know what the issues are and what the real on the ground challenges are for things like relocation, for internal migration, for how to, talking about megacities, how these megacities can cope with the incoming migration, at the same time that they have their own displacement risks in these megacities, especially when you have informal settlements built in floodplains and landslide-prone areas, for example. So I know I'm not really answering your question because I've just tossed the US out of it. But certainly at the moment, I also don't think that the US is in a position to lead anybody on anything, if I'm being honest, and hasn't demonstrated commitment to climate leadership or to migration leadership. I think that's very clear that migration is not an area that at least some big part of the population doesn't want to tackle in a reasonable, rational fashion, or have those discussions. And the same with climate. We're still there trying to convince people that climate change is not Tinkerbell. It doesn't exist just because you believe in it. So that, probably, François might have a more insightful response than I do on that.
Well, let me offer the floor to François, and also add to that a question which has come in from Erin Lonely on the floor, asking if, François, if you could also expand on the idea of developing policies based on perception rather than or in conjunction with data. And do you have any examples of how perception has or might influence policy making in the area of climate migration?
Yes, thank you. Maybe I'll start with your question on US politics after the election. It is very clear that during the 4 years of the Trump administration, clearly the center of gravity, at least of research, and I think of policy debates on climate change and migration, has clearly switched to Europe. This is very clear to me, and until 4 years ago, I was invited frequently in the US for academic seminars and conferences, and clearly I could see that this stopped under the Trump administration, not because American colleagues stopped researching on this, but because funding for organizing that kind of event or that kind of collaboration declined drastically. And clearly that was no longer a policy priority for the Trump administration. Now that it seems that we're heading towards a Biden administration, we'll see what will happen. Obviously, I expect at least an academic re-engagement of US universities and think tanks in that, and I'm hoping for more joint projects and joint collaborations. And clearly, these were extremely difficult to implement under the Trump administration. And I think that this is something that has been underreported, is how detrimental to the progress of science the Trump administration has been as well, especially in the field of climate change and migration and refugee studies. Now, when it comes to the actual policy, what we'll need to see is first whether or not the US rejoin the Paris Agreement. Joe Biden has announced that it would be his first decision if elected president. The thing is, to be honest, I'm not sure that this would be a really good idea for the US to rejoin the Paris Agreement. And I realize this is a very unpopular opinion and that most people seem to rejoice at the prospect of the US joining again the Paris Agreement. But I think that it would create some form of instability in the Paris Agreement. It would give the idea that countries can join and then exit and rejoin according to their election results, whereas the Paris Agreement is supposed to provide a stable and long-term framework for cooperation independently from election results. And I think this is extremely important for companies and markets to know that there will be no change in the framework depending on the elections. And I'm afraid that if the US were to rejoin the Paris Agreement right now, in 4 years, let's imagine that Ivanka Trump gets elected as president, then we might imagine that the US would exit again the Paris Agreement, and that would be a kind of flip-flopping constantly. And therefore, I'm not sure that this would be a good signal to send, and that beyond the initial enthusiasm of seeing the US rejoin the international cooperation on climate change, there are some disappointments. Also, let me be clear, Joe Biden is no Greta Thunberg, and therefore is certainly much better on climate change than a Trump administration would be, but he is not exactly what I would call an environmentalist. And clearly, he still has vested interest in oil and coal lobbies. And I think it's worthwhile to remember that the strategy of the US administration, including under Democratic administration, under the administration of either Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, has been to tone down the ambition of international cooperation on climate change. And we know we need renewed cooperation and renewed ambition on climate change, especially for COP26. So I'm not that sure that it would be a good idea to bring the US back at the negotiation table right now, because I'm afraid that this might tone down the ambition of COP26. So sorry I don't want to be a killjoy here or to dash the enthusiasm, but I think that we should consider carefully. In any case, what we say, or my opinion, will have no impact on the decision of the US to rejoin the Paris Agreement.
It's always good to have an unexpected point of view.
Now, on the question of the conjunction between policy decisions and data, I think that a mistake we make when we design policies regarding migration is that we expect that migrants will take rational decisions. And migrants take a lot of irrational decisions. And we all take a lot of irrational decisions. The US has had in the Oval Office for 4 years a man who was taking a lot of irrational decisions. And therefore, we often project on the migrants some qualities that we don't have ourselves. Half of the weddings, half of the marriages in Europe end up in a divorce. So if people were to act rationally, they wouldn't take the chance of getting married any longer. But people still get married because they're still hoping that they will be in the good half of people who don't divorce. And therefore, getting married is not a rational choice, but a lot of things you do. And thankfully, you do the things, you do them irrationally. And migrants act exactly the same way. And I think that this is something that we need to incorporate in policy design, the right for migrants to make irrational choices.
I know that we're running out of time, but I just want to say...
We are actually at time, in fact. I was just going to wrap it up. But but please just have a 1 minute.
Just to say that I don't entirely agree with this perspective on rational. My perspective working with people is that they have different rationales than what we think, or externally. So again, just because we don't see it as a rational decision, it doesn't mean that they don't have a rationale.
Absolutely.
Like just because it's an environmentally dangerous place to move to, there's an economic rationale, there's a social rationale, etc. So I think it's about seeing.
That's really true. What is rational for one will be rational for another.
Yeah, yeah. Look, this has been a super interesting discussion, both on the substance that we promised, but we've also managed to incorporate some deep psychology, some marriage advice. I feel that you've really given everybody what they came for this morning. So thank you very much indeed to our three speakers. And I would encourage everybody who's been involved, do go and have a look at the websites, the projects that our participants have been mentioning, because there's some really important work going on around this field. And with that, I wish you all an excellent Friday afternoon, and try and stay away from the election coverage and enjoy the sunshine if it's sunny where you are. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.